What's good people, it's your boy Nav, and in today's video I'm going to show you how I mix my beats. I've seen many producers that don't put in a lot of effort in learning how to mix their beats and simply call it a day by slapping a soft clipper on their master channels. Remember that you don't need to be an actual engineer to be able to do a basic mix, so I'm going to show you some basic quick steps that you can easily follow to make your beats sound better. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so before I start mixing my beats, I like to always organize my session. And the way I do it personally is to always go back to my original project file and make sure to export all of my track stems. The reason why I do this is because first, I have more control over each sound, and I will also use significantly less CPU power because there are no VSTs running in the background. So once I have exported all of my track stems, from there I make sure to route them properly to a mixer channel. And then from there, I would arrange the mixer channel based off what type of the instruments they are and use color grading to know what I'm actually looking at. Once the routing is completed, from there I make sure to adjust the volume knobs to make sure I get the general levels right. But keep in mind that as you're making progress throughout the mix, you will have to actually come back here and make adjustments if needed. For now, let's just take a listen to the raw mix and see how it sounds like and what we're dealing with. Okay, perfect. So the next step is to actually attenuate the unwanted frequencies. And this process is also called subtractive EQ. And the way it works is basically you apply an equalizer to get rid of the unwanted frequencies, or you can dip down the frequencies you want to hear less of. So now let's apply subtractive EQ to all of my instruments and see how it would sound like. Keep in mind that if a signal doesn't need to be equalized, you can just leave it be as is and you don't have to equalize everything. Just apply it to the places where you need to and keep everything else simple. So this is before equalizing the sounds. And this is after applying equalizing. Okay, perfect. So now that our signal is fairly controlled and cleaned up, you're ready to add saturation and give character to certain sounds. Saturation basically adds harmonics and causes mild compression. For example, I use RC20 on my instruments to create a little bit of distortion and also add a little bit of lo-fi effects to my beats. Let's take a listen. So now let's take a listen to the instruments without the RC20. And now let's take a listen to the after. I also like to use saturation on my 808s as well as the drums just to make them a little bit punchier and sound meaner. So let's take a listen now. So for the 808s, I like to use tube saturation by Saturn II, and I usually go with the warm tube. And for the drums, I really like to use the black box by Plugin Alliance. So now let's take a listen before adding the saturation. So now let's bring in the saturation on the bass only. And then let's bring in the saturation for the drums. See how you can hear so much more details in the drums, as well as the bass is so much meaner when it comes to the sub bass. So at this point, we can actually start the process of reshaping some of our sounds by adding EQ to amplify certain frequencies. And the way I like to do it is basically to either boost some of the mid and highs to make the sound a little bit brighter, or I cut down some of the unwanted lows that were added as part of the processing that we did previously. So let's take a listen, for example, to our instruments. Let's take a listen prior to adding the EQ. So it is sounding good, but it could be a little bit brighter. So now let's bring in this EQ and boost a little bit of the highs as well as a little bit of the lows. And then we cut slightly off the low end just to make sure that there is no unwanted frequencies added there. So at this stage, you can also add some of other effects that may add some more texture to your sounds. So for example, with my snares, I like to add a little bit of reverb here. And I like to really keep it simple by blending in the effects. And also for my hi-hats, I like to use the pan-man to actually keep swinging them between the left and right ears. It's a very minor subtle move, so you cannot actually hear it by itself, but it is adding some texture to the overall sound. It's so subtle that you can hardly actually notice it, but it is making a change when you listen to everything together. So at this point, we're pretty ready to process our bus channels. So the first thing I like to do is to make sure I actually sidechain my kick and the 808s to make sure they're not actually clashing with each other, because we didn't do that earlier. But the way I do it is basically to apply a compressor and then sidechain the kick to that compressor. So only when the kick is actually hitting, our 808 signal is going to be compressed. But when the kick is not present, our 808 is not going to have any compression whatsoever. I click on the kick channel and then I right click here on my 808 and sidechain to this track. You don't want to click on sidechain to this track only, because then it's going to take the signal away from my actual drums bus. So once I have the sidechain routed, I'm going to open up my compressor. By the way, you can do this with almost any compressor that is out there. You don't have to necessarily do it with this fat filter plugin, but if you do have it, I think it works great when it comes to sidechaining as well. So the way I do it is basically I turn on the sidechain here. I put it on external, go to the settings, and then processing, and select my kick signal. And then we go back here. And for sidechaining, I like to have a very fast attack and a fast release, because I want the compression to happen only in that split second when the kick is actually hitting. So now let's take a listen before adding the sidechain. You also see it here that when the kick is hitting, the bass is not actually ducking down. And then now we are sidechaining. But we need to adjust the threshold to make sure we're ducking enough. So let's listen closer without having any of the instruments playing. So as I said, let's take a listen without the sidechain being in place. And now with the sidechain. As you can see, every time the kick is hitting, the bass is actually ducking down, which is exactly what we're trying to accomplish here. So they're no longer also fighting for room in the low end side of things. It's like the bass is actually ducking away to create more room for the kick to be present. And then as soon as the kick goes away, the bass is back up. So the second thing that I really like to do is to actually go on my output bus and get rid of some of the resonance by applying the Suits plugin. So what I do is basically I go to the presets and then go on the master, and there is a preset called Balance to the Grammy Awards. I really like how this preset sounds, but we also need to make minor adjustments to make sure it is actually sounding right with our beat. So let's take a listen to it as is. So as you saw, like the signals are not actually being processed a lot because the threshold is set very low. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna raise this up to make sure we are actually capturing the signals. So now let's take a listen before applying the Suit plugin. This is just the instruments by themselves. So So now let's take a listen to the instruments only with the suit added. And now let's bring in the drums. And then the last thing I like to do is to actually make 3 of my drum elements in mono. The first thing I like to do is to actually make my 808 and kicks to be mono, as well as the snare. But I keep everything else on a stereo. Okay, perfect. So at this point, we're also ready to add some compression to bring up the details of some of the quieter sounds, and also make some of the other elements sound a little bit punchier and more distorted, for example, the drums. As well as using compression on drums bus to glue the sounds together. So I'm going to start with the drums bus actually. So I'm going to turn off the instrument bus and only listen to the drums and the 808 together. I also like to use compression on my guitar to bring some of the quieter details up. Okay, so at this point we have a pretty well balanced mix and we're ready to create a demo master. But keep in mind that if you're planning to send your track to a mastering engineer, you absolutely don't need to do any of these following steps. But because I know most of you guys watching are actually trying to mix your beats so you can make them sound nicer and actually post them on YouTube or your beat stores, you can actually follow some of the steps that I'm going to show you right now, just to make your stereo imaging a little bit nicer and wider, and also making the overall loudness a little bit better. So let's start with actually adding some EQ to our master channel. The first thing I like to do is to actually boost a little bit of the highs to make my sound a little bit more crispier. And then I'm going to process some of the mid frequencies. But the way I like to boost the mid frequency is to make my kick specifically sound punchier. And then at the very end, I'm going to boost some of the lows and use the high shelving to basically bring up the crisp of the sound a little bit even more. So let's start with hearing it first. So now let's take a listen to the before version. And now after. see how just applying some minor EQ on our master channel is making the overall sound a lot brighter and nicer, and in the low end it's just a little bit more solid. So once we're done with adding the EQ, we're now ready to start imaging. And the way I do it is basically anything up to around 140 Hz, I'm going to make it pretty mono. And then from there up to around, let's say 2000, I'm going to boost it slightly up to around, let's say 30%. And then everything else after up to around 8600, I'm going to boost it, but slightly less than my other channel. And lastly, for the super high frequencies, I'm going to make those mono as well. I want a little bit of a stereo delay. And also some makeup on the sides. So now let's take a listen to before. And now after. You see how the bass is so much more tamed now that we have pretty much monoed everything below 140 Hz. And the same thing for here. It's so much wider and has more room for the vocals to be present, or just the instruments generally not fighting with each other for room. And then for these small details and crisps on the high end, they don't need to be in stereo at all. I think in mono they sound nicer. Okay, so at this point we are ready to raise the loudness, and the way I like to do it is to basically put a limiter on. And my go-to limiter is actually the FabFilter Pro L2. And the way I do it is basically I go with the modern settings. I bring the channel transients to around 20%, leave the release on 100, and then I want a relatively fast attack and a slower release. With a little bit of look ahead. And I'm going to turn off the true peak limiting and actually activate the oversampling. And then I'm going to raise the signal to around 4 to 6 dB, depending on how loud you want the sound to be. Keep in mind that if you need to raise it even louder than 6 dB, I would highly recommend you to break the job into 2 and use 2 instances of the limiter instead of using 1. So let's take a listen to the before. It sounds nice, but it's not as loud as we wanted it to be. And now let's apply the limiter. So now let's go back to our master channel and turn everything off. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna import the before and after of this beat. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to play the before version. By the way, I exported this prior to recording. Everything was exactly as it was set in the beginning of the session. So let's start with the before version. So as you can hear, the beat sounds very muddy. There is no sidechain happening between the kick and 808, and the instruments are all over each other. So now let's move on to the after version. Remember that at the end of the day, our goal is to make our beats sound better than the original raw version. And as I mentioned earlier, we don't need to be mixing engineers to understand some of the basic concepts and apply those concepts to our own mix. Remember that if you're struggling now, by practicing more, your ears will actually start hearing the frequencies so much better, and mixing will become so much easier once you know exactly what you need to be looking out for. Thank you again for sticking around and watching this tutorial video. If you liked this episode, please make sure to like and subscribe to my channel to motivate me to want to make more of these videos for you guys. Also, if you have any recommendation, please make sure to let me know in the comment section below. For now, peace out until next time.